is today, 2024. So I'm actually talking about Arts Grant Funding 2025. So just ignore that slide. So the contents of today's chat, in general terms, will be what you need to know about Arts Grant Funding, what's required to make an application, how we assess your application, how you go about making an application, how to complete the AAOR template, and how your application is processed. So just by way of information, the goal in our current strategy, making great artwork, that underpins all of our funding programs, is that artists are supported to make excellent work that is enjoyed and valued, and that more people will enjoy high quality arts experiences. So Arts Grant Funding is one of a range of programs that we offer that delivers on those goals. The deadline, very important, 5:30 p.m. on Thursday, the 14th of March, 2024. And that's Ireland time. So if you're applying from outside Ireland, make sure that you get the application in before 5:30 local time. So the purpose of Arts Grant Funding is to ensure that there is a breadth of high quality arts activity and programs throughout the country by offering flexible support that responds to the needs of those who are making, presenting, and supporting work. So that's a general overview of the purpose. This is an important facet of Arts Grant Funding, is that it's throughout the country. And I think that's important just to emphasize that one of the Arts Council's goals, as I mentioned, is that more people will enjoy high quality arts experiences. So on that basis, we do try to attend to work that's happening all over the country. So that can mean in some instances that we have to take a strategic overview of where the work is happening. So that's just by way of saying that we're unlikely to fund all the applications that come in from Dublin, for example, or all the applications that come in from Cork. So in terms of the objectives of the award, it's intended to support more than one distinct arts activity taking place within a fixed period of time, or to provide supports or facilities to artists over a fixed period of time. And the focus of Arts Grant Funding is to deliver outcomes that develop the arts, either through generating high quality experiences for the public to engage with the arts, or providing excellent services, resources, or facilities that support the work of artists or the arts sector. Now, I think it's important to say that the Arts Grant Funding is a cross art form program that supports the entire range of work that the Arts Council supports across all of the art forms. And that would include things like arts participation, young people and children, and other types of maybe what might be described as art forms or art practice areas that involve more interaction or more maybe participation by end users, if you like. And also some of the organizations we fund might be things like artist studios, where they provide services like studios to artists. In theatre, the focus is really on presenting work to audiences, or making the creation of work for presentation to audiences. That's the focus. That's not to say that you can't apply to do those other things, like providing services or resources or facilities to artists, but the main focus is on supporting work. So just to be aware of that, because I think sometimes when people read the guidelines for Arts Grant Funding and they see things like provide services or facilities to artists or provide resources, that they think they have to do that. But in theatre, that's not a priority. The priority in theatre is about presenting work or making work that ultimately will be presented to audiences. So just something to be aware of, that you don't have to do all the things it says. So applications can be made to cover the cost of activities taking place from either January to December 25, so for 1 year in 25, or for the 2-year period from January 25 to December 26. So you can apply over 24 months if you want. If you want to apply over 4 months, we will only consider applications where you provide significant detail of the activities or programs in the year ahead. Now, what I will say is that for resourcing reasons and for reasons to do with the overwhelming demand, we haven't offered any 2-year funding in the last couple of years. I don't know what the situation is going to be like this year, but just to be aware of that we are, I suppose, less likely to award 2-year funding just because of the competitive context and because that limits our flexibility in terms of years ahead. So that's something to be aware of, but you can still apply for 2 years if you wish. So who can apply? Arts Grant Funding is open to organizations, including companies limited by guarantee, designated activity companies, or partnerships. And it's also open to individuals. If 2 or more individuals want to make a joint application, then one of them has to act as the named applicant. Okay. But if you are applying as a individual, then you must show that your proposal involves collaboration with other artists and activities that include the delivery of public outcomes or outcomes that benefit other artists. In other words, a playwright can't apply for AGF to say, I want to spend the year writing plays. The idea is that you are working in collaboration and in partnership with others, and you are delivering work on a wider. So it's not a glorified bursary, I suppose, is what I'm trying to say. So what can you apply for? You can apply for the creation, production, including co-production presentation of an artwork or event for the benefit of an audience or particular community. You can apply for the vision of arts experiences involving participants or targeted communities, the development and creation of a piece of work for future performance or distribution, the delivery of activities to support the development of the arts or the work of artists, the provision of supports, resources, or facilities for artists, research as part of a wider program of art form development, or development costs in, for example, talent partnership or audience development, and skills development and capacity building. So those are the range of types of things that you can apply for. Again, to make the point, really the focus of theatre is about the creation and production and presentation of work, or the development and creation of a piece of work for future performance. So while you can do those other things, and you're welcome to apply to do those other things, they're less of a priority in theatre, just so you're aware. So what do you need to make an application? So you need to complete the application form, obviously, and you also need to complete an arts activity, what we call the AAOR template, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. At least one and no more than 3 samples of previous work. And now, this is a key change from last year. You must provide a completed theatre project budget template for each proposed activity. So some of you who are familiar with AGF will know that there is a template, a kind of a standard template that we use called an activity template, but it's very high level and it's not very detailed, and it's not really detailed enough for us to be able to assess in detail a theatre proposal. So because of that, we are now insisting, and it's in the guidelines, that you need to provide a theatre project budget template for each activity. If you need one, just email us. As far as I know, it's available on the website, but if you need one, just let us know and we'll send it to you. But you absolutely need to use that because we need that level of detail. Also, CVs and biographies of all key personnel involved in the proposal, and letters of support or memos of understanding from key partners outlining any supports in cash or in kind, and also a public engagement plan. Now, to be clear about public engagement, the Arts Council's goal, as I said at the beginning, is that more people will enjoy high quality arts experiences. But when the Arts Council talks about public engagement, it means it in 2 ways. It means engaging more people, but it also means engaging people more deeply or in different kinds of ways. So I mentioned earlier, for example, the example of arts participation or YPCE, where a program of work might be as much about the quality of engagement with that target audience as it is about the number of people engaging. So in the case of theatre, it can be that you want to make a piece of work for a specific audience. It can be that you want to talk about a particular theme or particular idea that has a particular relevance to a particular cohort of people or particular community of people, or you want to work in a community context or in a local context or something like that. But it can also happen that you just want to put on plays for as many people as possible. So when we say public engagement plan, as I say there in the note, it can either be a marketing plan. This is how we're going to sell the show to get as many people as possible, or an audience development plan. This is how we're going to build audiences over time, or it can be an engagement plan, as in this is how we're going to kind of engage a particular type or kind of audience, or it can be a combination of those things. But it doesn't have to be all of those things, and you don't have to do all of those things. You have to do at least one of those things, but you don't have to do all of them. So that's just something to be aware of as well. Obviously, the more you can talk about your audience and who you feel your audience is for your work and who you think will respond to the work, the better. And the more you've thought about that in terms of your own planning as artists or as organizations, obviously that's all to the benefit of your application. But just to be clear that it can be about getting as wide an audience as possible, or it can be about reaching a specific audience or some combination of those two. So how we process your application. So we follow the steps below to consider applications, decide on them, and then contact applications. So after you submit your application, you will receive 2 emails, or you should receive 2 emails. The first will be sent immediately and will acknowledge your application, and the second will arrive a few minutes later and will contain your application number, which we will use in all correspondence. I'm assuming most of you on the call today are familiar with the application process and familiar with the system. So none of this should come as too much of a surprise to you. Once we receive your application, we'll check and make sure it's eligible for Arts Grant funding. And if we decide your application is not eligible, either because it does not meet the purpose or because you've not fully satisfied the requirements, we'll write to you and tell you your application is ineligible and it won't go any further in the process. So that's what to expect when the application first gets processed. Then all eligible applications are assessed and scored based on the criteria. And I will talk about the criteria in a little while, but they're artistic quality, meeting the aims of the award, and feasibility. Then draft assessments and scores go through a moderation process overseen by an independent moderator to ensure consistency of approach and assessment and scoring. So what will happen there is the various arts teams will come together and have a conversation so that there's an overview of the entirety of all the applications being assessed, and there aren't too many outliers, or one team isn't scoring way higher than another team. And so there's a kind of a consistency of approach. So it means it's a very rigorous process, and each assessment is being compared to others so that there's a sense of fairness and proportionality about it. Then we prepare recommendations for council for any recommendations for applications that have asked for 50,000 or more, which in the case of theatre is probably most of them. And then we make recommendations for the Arts Council Executive if they're for applications less than 50,000. And then the Council Executive review and discuss recommendations and make a final decision on funding amounts based on the budget and the overall arts context. Now, I should say that this is a challenge for us, and this has always been a challenge for us, is that, for example, and some of you will be familiar, you may have applied for project funding, for example, and you will know from applying for project funding that the way it tends to work is that we ask you to set out what you want to do. We ask you to provide a budget template, and generally, if you're successful, you get what you asked for. So it means you can deliver the project as applied for. The reason for that was because historically, it tended to happen, or it could happen sometimes, where the council or panels, peer panels, for example, would kind of maybe shave a little bit off an application because they were trying to help more people get some kind of funding, which was very laudable and not unreasonable. But it always meant that the applicant then had to go, well, I didn't get what I asked for, so now I can't do everything I said I was going to do. Unfortunately, with Arts Grant funding, well, I don't know whether you call it unfortunately or fortunately, I don't know. But a feature of Arts Grant funding is that historically, we haven't been able to award the full amount that's been asked for. And in fact, we say that in the application, that in the event that you don't get the full amount that you ask for, can you tell us which of your activities are the key priorities? This is something we're looking at. This is something we talk about all the time. But the simple fact is, if we were to give the top scoring applicants everything they asked for, we'd be able to fund much fewer organizations or applicants. So what we've tended to do is to try and split the difference between giving people a reasonable amount to allow them to do something, but giving as many people as possible something. So it's about a balancing act. But just be aware of that the likelihood is that we're not going to be able to offer everything that's been asked for. Okay, oh, there we go. Let me see. Sorry, my slide presentation froze there. Bear with me. Okay, so how to make your application. So in the guidelines, there is a section, and this is lifted from that just to explain how the process works. So there's information on how to use the application form. And part one of that is you give general information. Part two is where you give information about yourself and your proposal. And then part three is your planned activities, where you list out each individual activity and you give us a brief description of that. And then separately, you would use the AAOR template to show the costs and any incomes against those activities. And then you're asked a series of questions where you describe how you believe your proposal meets our assessment criteria. So yeah, as I highlight there, the planned activities, it's really important that you list the planned activities as part of the application form in the same order that you list them in the AAOR, so that we can track one across to the other. So the AAOR template looks like this. And again, you will give each activity a name, you'll give a brief description of the activity, and then you'll give information about the key personnel involved and the proposed date. So that's the information in the application form. And then the brief description is where you get to describe what it is. And then the AAOR template is where you give the facts and figures and numbers. Now, when you get to the AAOR template, which is a separate Excel document, the first part is core expenditure and income. In general, as a rule, arts grant funding is not intended to support core expenditure and income. Arts grant funding is intended to support activities only. So if you have what you might consider overhead costs or administrative costs or things like phone bills and utility and lights and bills, we expect you to directly apply those to each activity. So you would kind of amortize them over the activities that you're undertaking. You wouldn't ask for them as part of core expenditure. It can and does happen that some organizations that we fund through Arts Grant funding have other programs of work, or they do other types of work. So they have core income and expenditure, and they might want to give us that information there. But for most theatre applicants, just ignore that. Don't put anything in there. Unless you have your own core expenditure, which is being met by money from somewhere else, like a local authority or sponsorship or fundraising or some other commercial income, then don't worry about the core income and just go on to the activity itself. So I showed you that template earlier, the table in the application form. So here is where you would list the activities and give us information about what's the main art form, what's the activity type, who are the primary target audience, and then the cost, the earned income, any income from other sources, and the subsidy. And this is really important because this shows us what the direct cost to you of putting on each activity is and what the subsidy required for each of those activities is. And that's very important in the case that, like I said earlier, we're not in a position to give you everything you've asked for. Then you could go back and revisit that, and we can have a conversation about it if your application is successful, you can go back and talk to us and say, okay, well, based on what you've given us, we're going to do activity 1, 2, and 3, and we're not going to do activity 4, 5, and 6, as the case may be. So that's a really important part of the process. Now, in addition, and I do appreciate this is a lot of work, and I will talk about that in a minute, you need to give us a detailed budget for each of the individual activities. And this is really important because we really need to see the detail of how you arrived at the costs. And we need to know that you've thought about these costs. So this is a standard theatre project budget template. And there is a version of this available, as I said. So most of you will be familiar with this. But what it asks you to do is break down in detail the number of cast performances, the number of stage management personnel, the number of key creatives, the number of performances, etc., etc. Now, again, we do appreciate this is hard work. Again, we do appreciate there's an awful lot of detail in here. For most of what you're asking for will be either the production of a play or the development of a new play. So in those contexts, this budget will work very well. It can and does happen where there may be an activity you want to do which isn't really about production or presentation or development, but you have to use this budget template anyway. I mean, in that context, you kind of have to make it work. Because we talked about this internally and we thought, well, if it's not a production or a presentation, then does it have to be this budget? And we thought the cleanest thing is just keep it all on the one budget, because otherwise it gets very messy. So you just have to kind of make it work to the best of your ability in terms of any activities that aren't either production or development. So general tips for applying. Download the guidelines, read the guidelines again. I'm sorry to have to say that in that way, but it really is important that you understand the guidelines. If you have any questions about the guidelines, get in touch with us. Complete the application form, get someone else to read it, complete your detailed budgets, complete the AAOR template, gather your supporting documentation together as per the guidelines. Start all of this now and aim to have your application in at least 48 hours in advance. I know many of you have heard me say this many times before, and we do realize there's a lot of pressure making an application like this. It's quite complicated. But our advice is to start early and try your very best to aim to have it done. Because if you do have any technical issues or any problems, if you leave it to the last day, it makes it much more difficult for us to actually be able to help you. So please, please, please try to make sure you get the process ended. So at least then if you discover you have a problem, there's time to contact us and there's time for us to help you out. Now, this bit, I'm afraid to have to say, is the health warning. So this is the competitive context. And I know I've spoken to some of you individually in the past about this, and I know I've mentioned this in other contexts, but I think it's really important to stress this, that we are in the very challenging position that the demand for arts grant funding, it just increased really, well, you can see there on the curve, it just increased an awful lot last year. So the overall demand was around 4 million up to 2022, and then it crept up in 23, and then for 2024, it was over 6 million. So it was a very significant jump. And the budget, as you can see, the orange line underneath, barely increased at all in 2024. Now, we don't know what the funding outlook is for 2025, but being realistic about it and being honest about it, there is unlikely to be a significant uplift in the available budget next year. So you need to be aware that this is a really competitive award, really, really competitive. You also need to be aware that there are a number of pretty well established companies in the arts grant funding portfolio at the moment. So that makes it even more competitive for newer companies or for newer entrants. Again, this is something we're looking at. This is something we're thinking about, but that is the situation at the moment. So just be aware, if you're thinking about putting the time and thought and effort into making an arts grant funding, particularly if you've never done it before, just be really aware that it's going to be very, very competitive and very, very tough. So I mean, on the one hand, I don't want to be too discouraging, but on the other hand, I just want you to be realistic about thinking about whether this is something you're ready for at this point. In terms of the general trend, the average number of awards we made since 2019 has been 15, and the average value of the grant awarded has been 145,000. We say in the guideline document that the average award, I think, is about 65,000, but that's across all the art forms. In theatre, it tends to be of the order of 145,000. So just so if you're looking for a sense of where to pitch it, that's just to make you aware that tends to be average. Now, some companies, obviously some companies, especially older, more established ones, are on more than that, and other younger companies are on a bit less than that. But just to make you aware that that's more or less where we've landed over the last couple of years in terms of the number we've been able to support and the amount we've been able to give them. Okay. So having said all that about the competitive context, the best applications are clear, concise, and compelling in a highly competitive context. I know to some extent there's not a lot you can do about that. And again, I do advise people that you can't second guess the application process. You can't know who you're up against or what you're up against. All you can do is express as clearly and concisely as possible what you want to do, and give a sense of why you think it's important, why you think this particular work at this particular time is important for your development as artists, but also potentially for audiences and how it will connect, how the work is relevant. Have all your support materials supplied and clearly identified. Demonstrate a direct link between the supporting material and the application. So as mentioned previously, if your application is about a particular kind of work and you've never really done that kind of work before, and you provide examples of work that aren't really relevant to that, obviously that's going to be less convincing in a competitive context. And that you clearly address the priorities and criteria of the award. So, I mean, those are our kind of top tips on what a good application looks like. The most common mistakes to avoid, I've already said this: not giving yourself enough time, not reading the guidelines thoroughly, or assuming you know them. Supporting material is missing, not meeting the award criteria, or not checking the IT requirements properly ahead of the deadline. What I will say about not reading the guidelines thoroughly is that there have not been many changes between 2024 and 2025, or between the last round and this round. So there haven't been that many changes. That's partly because we're currently taking stock of all our funding programs, so we're not trying to shake things up too much at the moment. The key change is the one I highlighted earlier, that you must use the theatre budget template. So that's the key change from a theatre perspective. But other than that, there aren't any really significant differences between the last 2 years. But having said that, still make sure you read the current guidelines carefully. And if you have any questions, let us know. Okay, and if you have any general queries, please email theatre@artscouncil.ie. And if you have any technical queries, you can email onlineservices@artscouncil.ie. As I said earlier, if you give yourself plenty of time to make an application and you run into trouble and you get in touch with us, I promise you that 99% of the queries we get can be answered straight away. Even by our, the first point of contact often is reception, and reception know the answers to pretty much all of the questions. So in fact, and there is no stupid question. If you have a problem, just ring up and someone will be able to answer the question very quickly. So just don't leave it to the last day. And I mean, I think most of you are familiar with the team by now, but just to remind you, there's Kira, there's Maeve, there's Bea, and there's myself. And so that is the presentation. So we will stop the recording now, and I will take any questions. Thank you very much.